Greetings from Tokyo. I'm Trip, and welcome to the Hammer of Wrath. This week, you and I are going to discuss how I completed 12 combat patrols in 12 months. Let's go. Thanks for joining me in the studio. This week, you and I are going to discuss how I completed 12 combat patrols in 12 months. But more importantly, we're going to talk about how and why. Now, as we proceed through this year-long review and discuss each combat patrol briefly, in the corner of the screen at the start of every month will be a link to the full video for that combat patrol. So let me walk you through how I completed 12 combat patrols in a year. This whole thing started innocently enough when I realized I had almost everything for the old Dark Angels combat patrol. So I rushed out and picked up the Redemptor Dreadnought kit. Now, I will say that I feel like the legs are way over-engineered, there's too many parts, and they were a bit tricky to put together, but the rest of the kit went together pretty well. I also had this really great 3D custom-printed base that I thought would be appropriate, because a lot of my Dark Angels are on sort of ruined or rubble-filled temple bases. Now, I put the whole thing together and I applied my primer coats with the airbrush. Looking back, I would have done a few things differently. You'll notice that I kept some of the armor panels separately to make them easier to paint in a lighter color. But there are places like the lower legs here where I primed everything in black and ended up doing 5 coats of Ushabti bone to get back up to that bone white. It would have been a lot smarter to do that in reverse, paint them in the lighter color, and then just do the mechanical parts in a black, which always covers in a single coat. But you live and learn. It was a lot of fun to put together, and I enjoyed doing a lot of the smaller details like this heat burn on the end of the plasma rifle, and then of course masking it off and doing a really great glow effect. Now, one of the things I like to do on vehicles is called sponge chipping, and this is just sort of stolen from the scale model hobby. It's a great way to put wear and tear on a model that's seen a lot of action, and I also trolled my Dark Angels upgrade sprue bits from my old Firstborn kits and found these really great banners, scrolls, and shields to apply to the model. With the Dark Angels Combat Patrol complete, I realized I could also complete the new Space Marine Combat Patrol by using some of my existing Dark Angels models with some modifications. So I took the Librarian, chopped off his right hand, and replaced it with this really great 3D printed axe. And I had all the Terminators already painted, but needed to change the plasma cannon out for the assault cannon. So I trolled my bits box, found that, and decided to magnetize the parts so that if I ever want to use these in a larger point game, I can switch between the plasma or the assault cannon. So I finished painting that up and moved on to the Infernus Marines. As this is a new unit for 10th edition, of course I didn't have that previously painted, but I did decide to sort of Dark Angel them up a bit more using these great 3D printed bits from Greytide Studios. Now, you gotta maul the shoulder pauldrons to get them off because they are molded in, but they do look great once you go through the effort. I also found some really great tabards, and then you'll notice that on each of the backpacks is a brazier, which I really thought fit with the sort of fire theme of this unit. I went through and painted them in my usual Dark Angels style, doing a light dry brush over top, and then using a wash of Bealtan green to knock everything back. I used the airbrush for a quick highlight on my pauldrons, and then I just go through and paint all the details like the chest Aquila and the tabards with Ushabti bone. Then I'll go through with the Games Workshop Seraphim Sepia and do all the shading there. It's really great, brings out the shadows, but saves you having to paint all the edge highlights on those. We're going to paint the weapon casing red, which is traditional with Dark Angels, and then we'll go through and use some Nuln oil to bring out the details on our metallics, then use a couple different inks to bring a heat burn effect to the end of the barrel. Now you notice I've kept the backpack separate for ease of painting. You go in there and do the details, and then for the fire, it's really just easy. It's a base color yellow and some dry brush of some orange along the top. I also printed a robed 3D head from that same kit for the sergeant, and for the eyes on the other troopers, I paint them white, and then add a single drop of contrast Blood Angels for a great effect. Now I had some 3D printed temple bases for these, so we're going to have to go ahead and super glue those down to finish them up. Now, it was right around this time that I was feeling full of myself because I had technically completed 2 combat patrols in 2 months, so realizing that I had also painted a bunch of Tau in the past, and all I needed for that Tau combat patrol was the Ghost Keel, I went out and grabbed one of those and started working on it. Now, I created these 3D printed parts. You can actually find them on my page on Cults 3D. There are additional weapon mounts, so you can put all 3 weapon options on the model. Now, the Combat Patrol calls specifically for the Fusion Blasters, but if you want to use these in bigger point games, you don't need to limit yourself. If you buy these parts and then use those instead, you can mount all 3 weapon options. Now, I've kept the head separate here for ease of painting. We don't want that red paint anywhere near the white body, and I am using an oil wash here. I've applied a gloss varnish. I apply my oil paint, as you see, into all the panel lining and details, sort of runs in there, gets it done really quickly. It almost feels like cheating. So go ahead and finish up some smaller details on the head, plug that back in, and we're actually in a really good place. Put some decals on in. This is where I decided to sort of try something new. In the lore, this thing can cloak, and while I was trolling my local hobby shop, I found this. It is pre-cut hex mask, so I went ahead and applied a bunch of that, and using my airbrush, made the color of the base match the color of the legs as though it was decloaking from the ground up, and applied some washes there to finish everything off with a dry brush. And you'll see here, when we start peeling this off, we get this really clean, really great hex effect on there. And then we'll go through and sort of edge highlight that with an electric blue and then a white inside to give an electronic feel as though it's decloaking. Orktober marked the first full combat patrol from scratch, and that box is one chonker. It comes with almost a pound of plastic inside. Now, knowing that I had to get through an entire combat patrol without having some previously painted units in a single month, I decided to speed paint these guys, and the theme of the entire video is skipping the details and still getting great looking miniatures. So the idea here basically is that we're going to hit our major color areas, block in our colors, and then use an oil wash to bring out all the details. You'll notice that I'm putting the oil wash everywhere except where we've painted white to prepare it for the skin. And here, we're just going to use a little contrast Plague Bearer flesh and some contrast medium. It flows right over all the areas that we prepared, and it looks great in a single coat. Moving on to the Deathcopters, one of my absolute favorite units. And to be honest, this might be my favorite patrol of all 12. The Orks are just so much fun. They're silly and also menacing, and just the aesthetic of the new models is really great. And I painted the original Deathcopters in 5th edition starter, so it was great to be able to go through and do the new ones here. And doing the Death Dread also was a lot of fun. Again, we're just going to throw in some color here. If there's overspray, it's fine. We're going to be able to clean that up a little later, and honestly, Orks would have overspray anyway. Doing the metallics here with an oil wash really makes everything look grimy and grungy, and that was the key to sort of getting this one finished quickly, was blocking in colors and then just covering everything in oil wash and wiping it away to get that grungy effect. There's no such thing as a clean Ork. The war boss here, I decided to do something special and put him on one of my heroic bases. I bought the Games Workshop Heroic Bases kit almost 10 years ago. I'm not even sure if it's still available, really. And I decided that my centerpiece for this army needed to be raised up. So I found this really great sort of sewer pipe kit, and I decided to make a toxic sludge underneath. So I did an underspray of Tesseract Glow, and then I used some UV curing resin to create a hardened pool of slime underneath, and put some rust on there, and then just used plastic glue to mount him on there, and he ended up looking great. November was next, and having painted thousands of points of Tyranidss and over 60 Termagants, I left the Termagants from the Combat Patrol in the box. There was no way I was going to paint another 20. Moved right on to the new units, including the Barb Gaunts here. Now, Tyranidss are my first true love in Warhammer. Of course, everyone starts with a starter box, and I painted the 5th edition starter, Assault on Black Reach. But the first army, the first models that I bought outside of that were Tyranidss. I went straight for the monstrous creatures. They drew me in immediately. And some of these new sculpts, including the Psychophage, which we'll see here in a minute, it's been forever since I've painted Tyranid models. Anyone who's collected them long enough knows that they haven't had a new model since 2014. So it was a long time coming. So painting the new units in this Combat Patrol was a lot of fun. I know the Winged Prime isn't that strong, and a lot of people aren't keen on the wings down pose, but it actually kind of grew on me. I did put him on a sculpted 3D rock base here. Again, my HQ units, I want to elevate them a bit, give them some more importance. So I put the HQ on the elevated base and then moved on to the Psychophage. Again, painting monstrous creatures is what got me into the hobby. I walked into the shop, played the 5th edition starter demo game, and immediately bought a Tyranifex afterwards. So painting this was a lot of fun, and it's a really great model. The tendrils on the front are just incredible. I absolutely loved it. You'll see the custom basing bits here. I actually partnered with Epic Basing Studios who sent me these alien growths, and they actually added a lot to the sort of scenic elements in all of my new Tyranidss. I really appreciated it. If I hadn't tricked myself into thinking that this whole challenge would be easy by sort of cheating on those first 3 Combat Patrols, this is when the reality of it set in. For December, I decided to tackle the Space Wolves Combat Patrol, and I've always wanted to have a Space Wolves army. When I first got into the hobby, my good friend Aaron had a Space Wolves army, and I was always secretly envious of the amount of character that was in those models. Those first run models, again, the proportions can be a little sort of strange looking now if you look back at them, but there's no denying that they had a ton of character, and a lot of that was lost when Games Workshop made the transition to Primaris. But thankfully, there are third-party studios like Grey Tide Studios, which I partnered with for this video, which creates this Primal Hounds pack. It has nearly 300 different bits, and it makes the models look like Space Wolves again. It comes with these really great bases with all these runes and rubble and Nordic symbols on them, and I had a great time painting these up, quickly dry brushing them, adding some Valhalla and Blizzard for that cold aesthetic. I used super glue to mount them down, of course, because it's a plastic to resin connection, and then I moved on to Haldor Ice Pelt. Now, unlike the generic units that are included in the Combat Patrol, he is pretty wolfy, but I used those Grey Tide Studios bits to push him even further. Now, the thing that I did do with the Invictor Warsuit here was use those Grey Tide Studio bits to turn it into more of a Dreadnought. I don't like the idea of an open cockpit, sort of battle mech. It just seems sort of silly, right? How are you not going to have any protection? You're going to have an open cockpit. So I found this really great cockpit cover online, and then I used the bits to sort of wolf up the entire thing. Now, much like the Dreadnought that started all this, I kept most of the armor panels separately, and I took some of those learnings from that first Dreadnought that I painted in July and made this a lot easier, a lot simpler. And then we'll go through and add all these sort of wolfy bits to it and the chipping and weathering that we're going to use across the entire army. My Dark Angels are relatively clean, but I wanted my wolves to look battered and worn. first thing I did with the Necron Combat Patrol was double up my Scarab Swarms. Fortunately, these models are from Indomitus, the 9th edition starter. I had extras, so I was able to stack them up and get a really great swarm effect. Now, my paint scheme for Necrons is actually really simple, and I think they might be the simplest army to paint in all of 40k. If you just want to get them on the table, all you need is a silver spray, some washes, and a dry brush, and you're good to go. And my recipe doesn't actually deviate much from that. I am hitting the warriors here in the chest with an airbrush burst and then doing a heavy dry brush over, and you'll see what that does is it keeps the inside of the chest red. It looks like this evil heat energy is emanating from them. And then I'll just go through and hit the other parts of the Gauss Blaster and any place where there might be energy to match that. Now I'm using a Grelin Earth here. All of my Necrons are on this arid, barren wasteland, and a Grelin Earth is this technical paint from Games Workshop. It does a great job. You lay it on thick, it crackles, it just looks really great. And this is also one of the first times I've really used weathering powders. I experimented with them a little bit on the Ork Combat Patrol, but here I was using it to a much greater effect along the legs of all the Necrons, sort of tie them into the dusty desert base. The Doomstalk was actually really easy to put together. It's only like 17 parts altogether, and it was a lot of fun. Here you'll see me doing some object source lighting with the airbrush. When you have an airbrush, it's a complete snap to do something like that. But I did finish it with some brush dabbing. I wanted to get like a firefly effect for the energy coming in instead of a smooth, perfect gradient. As I mentioned, a heavy application of a Grelin Earth along with some static grass tufts glued into strategic spots, and a generous application of weathering powder to tie everything together. It was at this point that I was really starting to feel the fatigue of attempting to complete a combat patrol every month, so I decided for February to cheat just a little bit and complete the Votann Combat Patrol, which I had purchased and started 1 year earlier. I had already completed the Call as well as the Berserkers for this, so in order to finish the Combat Patrol for the month, I just needed to complete the Pioneers on those really great hover bikes and these the Hearthkin Warriors. Now, I decided to go with the Trans-Hyperion Alliance simply because I'd never painted an orange army before and it looked like fun. So that's exactly what I did. Now, I always keep my head separate here. As you can see, it makes for ease of painting. You can get in there and do all the details. On the Berserkers, there was a lot more skin, obviously. There's these bare-chested little lunatics that run around with power axes and power gauntlets. And it's a really simple recipe. It's just, some flesh tones with some washes and then a dry brush. I wanted to set them apart from the other units in the Combat Patrol, so I gave them green fatigues along the bottom and used the chance to bring that orange back in on the power gauntlets. Now, the Pioneers were the unit I was actually looking most forward to in the entire Combat Patrol. I've not really painted a vehicle outside of those 2 dreadnoughts in a very long time. The leather coats here turned out better than I'd hoped. It's really just a layer of burnt umber and then a couple of dry brushes on top of that of lighter browns. It's always nerve-wracking to do a pinstripe down a model that's technically already finished. If you mess it up, you've got to repaint the whole thing, but I managed to get through that. And then I decided to put them on some frozen lake bases. So here, again, we're just using that light curing UV resin, and then the trick is to go in with a couple different grits of sandpaper and sort of buff it down so it's not overly shiny. Now, the Call, I have a separate video on. It's actually the first model in the box that I had completed. It's a lot of fun, and my idea here was that he would be white to stand out against all of the orange forces, and then his armor wouldn't be all banged up like the others, and that as the Call, he maybe has a serf that maintains his armor every day. Now, I did want to put him on a frozen lake base as well, but he comes with this tactical rock. The rock can't be sitting on top of the ice, of course, it has to come from underneath, so I've created this 40mm well base, filled that with UV resin, then applied the snow and other effects on top. I was really happy with the way the Space Wolves turned out for December's videos, so for March I took the opportunity to once again tackle the Vanguard Space Marine Combat Patrol, this time using all of the units from the 10th edition starter set Leviathan, and those really great 3D printed parts from Grey Tide Studios. So here I've just gone through, having perfected my blue recipe for the Marines I painted in December. I've just applied that to all the Infernus Marines. I'm using this really great rubberized mask. You can just brush it on, and once it's done, you just peel it off and you get your protected paint underneath. I utilized a combination of resin 3D printed heads and the plastic heads from the Games Workshop Space Wolves upgrade sprue, but all of the models had to be glued to their resin bases using super glue. Now, with the Infernus Marines complete, I moved on to the brand new Terminators. Everyone loves the new Terminators. They're really incredible. The new proportions are fantastic, and the kit comes with a ton of great resin bits like shoulder pauldrons, power fists, and these ice blades that I couldn't pass up giving the Sergeant an ice blade. We're going to go through and use some sponge chipping here. I want, as I mentioned previously, I want my wolves to just be battered and beaten. These guys they're space Vikings. They don't care. The dings and chips on their armor are the marks of a battle well won. So I've just sort of gone a little overboard on that. Here with the Librarian, the trick was to put the head in first and then put the sort of front armor on after because of the way the head is wedged in there. And I've gone ahead and done some elemental effects on the power axe there. It's a lot of fun. I love doing characters, and here's a great example. The HQ, I gave him a Thunderhammer, of course, right? The rules just specify power weapon. How are you not going to give a Space Viking a giant Thunderhammer? And the STL kit has a couple really good ones in there. And it also has this really just ridiculous ornate belt buckle with these tusks coming off. And again, I couldn't pass up using that. The base is really fun. I, of course, painted it in the theme of my Tyranid army and then finished it off by applying the cape and some snow on the base. At this point in April, we were entering the home stretch. I could see the finish line, and despite the fact that I was suffering a bunch of fatigue, I needed a change of pace. I had never painted Eldar before, and the Combat Patrol has this really great Wraith Lord in it. The minute I saw it, I knew that I was going to paint it, but more importantly, I was going to completely repose it. So check out the full video on this. I spent a lot of time just sort of chopping the model apart and reposing it. The warriors here were a lot of fun. You'll notice I've put these little leg warmers. That's like a poster tack leg warmer. It's going to keep the spray from getting on their legs, and I'll just do a dry brush here on that base and then clean up the very edges with a little black paint. I did Samhain, or however you pronounce it. I'm sorry if you're an Eldar player and I butchered that, but I wanted to add my own personal touch, and you'll see that there's a black gradient on every unit in a different way. On the warriors, it comes up from the bottom of their legs. On the jet bikes, it comes from the nose cone and on the wing tips. And I decided to make the riders in a dark color. And the official paint scheme, it's red on red, and the rider kind of gets lost, so I wanted them to pop a little more. Now, onto the Wraith Lord. I found this really great 3D printed statuary head. So I just sort of chopped it to make it look like it was laying in rubble. And then here's where it gets a little hairy. You gotta be willing to completely disassemble the model, basically chop it apart, put some additional paperclip wiring in there for posability, resculpt some of the soft seals and other things. Don't be afraid. Get in there, chop it up. In the end, you're going to be able to fix it, and you end up with a really unique pose, right? So we'll lay down that white over our prime, and we get this really powerful red over top. And like the warriors, we're just going to bring in the gradient from the feet up there, and we'll put those silly putty leg warmers back on it while we do the base. This is just some Seraphim sepia and then a dry brush that. You'll see that in a lot of the artwork that Games Workshop uses. The Eldar are always on these sort of ancient stone bases. Now here, I've used a decal softener to get that thing to wrap around the helmet. I have a separate tutorial for this on my channel. Be sure to check it out. Before I even started on the Imperial Guard Combat Patrol, I knew how I wanted to tackle it. I needed to get through like 36 infantry models and some gun emplacements and a walker in a month, and the idea here was to speed paint everything and use oil washes. I found these really great 3D printed trench bases, and that's where the entire idea for the army came from. We're just going to slather these guys in mud, grime, and oil wash to make it look like they have been battling endlessly for months and months in these muddy, rotten trenches. So the key here is to lay down our base coats, sort of a color by numbers look, and then we'll use the airbrush to apply a burnt umber along the bottom, okay if some overspray gets on the feet, and then we'll put a gloss varnish on the models and then slather everything in a brown oil wash. Wipe that away, leaving the oil in the recesses. You get definition in your shapes, and you get this muddy, grungy, grimy aesthetic. It's like a grimdark, but super fast and easy. Now these bases, I don't recommend trying to cover these giant, I think there are like 120 millimeter oval bases with Games Workshop texture putty. You'll go broke doing that. Go to your hobby shop, find a much cheaper brand, and then apply that instead. Now I've used an olive drab here, of course, keeping with a very traditional Imperial Guard theme. They're Cadians, and Cadia may have fallen, but these guys haven't. I also found these really great 3D printed bits you'll have noticed in the background here. These were all for free on Cults 3D, the sandbags, the ejected shell casing, the piles of shells, the additional ammo crates. All of that stuff I 3D printed that was free on Cults. Once the basing was complete, we glue in place all of our artillery as well as the crew members that come with it, and finish them off by applying a matte varnish to knock down the gloss. When doing cockpits and things like that, these clamps from the dollar store are indispensable to make sure that there are no gaps. And we just go through and apply our colors and our decals and our oil washes like we have with everything else. We'll hit it with a matte varnish and finish off the last few details like the plasma cannon. And with that, we arrive at the final combat patrol of the challenge. This one nearly didn't get completed. If you might have picked up during the course of this video, I was really sort of hitting a wall around February and March, and I almost didn't finish this, but I didn't want to disappoint myself and the subscribers, so I decided on the new Chaos Space Marines Combat Patrol, which had just been released, and I put it up for voting on my Patreon, and they voted for Night Lords. So I found these really great 3D printed heads online. They have exactly the aesthetic we want with the bat wings and the skull face. I also found a really great bat-themed axe for the aspiring champion. And this video was actually sponsored by the Army Painter, who sent me their Mega Painter set, and I painted all of these models entirely with their brand new Fanatic paint range. Now, they are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but honestly, I was kind of surprised by the coverage a lot of them gave. Almost every color, even the lighter colors that don't normally do so, like reds and yellows, covered in 2 coats, sometimes 3. Honestly, pretty impressive, and I will be using a lot of the colors moving forward. If you are looking to pick up some new paints, I highly recommend them. I have a lot of fun doing the possessed here as well. I really enjoy doing the mutated parts like the arms and the horns that are breaking through their armor. Here I'm using some of the lighter skin tones to sort of bring up the relief in the muscles, and then using their bone colors to do the horns and claws. My favorite paint of all time is Lead Belcher by Games Workshop, but honestly, these metallics are very close. They offer decent coverage and have a small metal flake that keeps them from looking too sparkly. And their technical paints like this True Blood are actually pretty decent as well. Now, the model I was most looking forward to the entire kit is the Master of Possession. Previously, this was only available in an out-of-production set, and I had a great time painting him up, especially the warp flames that were coming off of his power pack. And there you have it, a questionably sane undertaking in which I managed to complete a combat patrol every month for 1 calendar year. Let me be clear, I don't recommend this. There were times when I was at my lowest during this challenge where my joy of the hobby was completely shattered and I was questioning my life choices. Honestly, it looks impressive on the tabletop, and I am proud of the work that I managed to accomplish, but it was a grind. And if there's one surefire way to sap the joy and love out of a hobby is to turn it into a grind. So don't do this. But I am hopeful that some of the lessons held within each of these combat patrols, whether it's learning to skip the small details in a combat patrol to keep it from becoming a slog, or slathering everything in an oil wash to paint it quickly in the grimdark style, I hope you found something useful from one of these individual videos. Now, a challenge like this would not be possible without the financial support of my Patreon followers, so I cannot thank you enough for what you've done, not only for this challenge, but for the channel in general. If you'd like to join our Patreon, follow the link in the description below, and remember that joining at any level grants you access to our private Discord server, where like-minded hobbyists help each other out every day with honest and kind feedback. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.